This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam. And I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people had so much to gain and had such an material motive for putting me in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts come aboard to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are in very high positions, yeah? Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 165. I'm your co-host Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, once again, accidentally, I think we've stumbled into what may become a several-part series, as we do so often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were just talking about how our initial plans for this kind of snowballed a little bit. This is supposed to be like a tantalizing prequel to something that we had thought about doing in this vein, but now it's like become its own thing based on the amount of research that primarily Dimitri did into this topic that I think you're pretty passionate about.
Yes.
Something you're really into these days, for sure.
Well, yeah. I think I did go a little hard like the last few days, digging up some really interesting things. And yeah, we started out a few weeks ago saying, hey, let's do a history about sus raves and like rave culture, because it's a really prime, I think, target or area of interest, I think, for Subliminal Jihad this year. Not only for my own personal investigations into this sort of resurgent underground, though it never really went away, but in terms of other subjects that we've talked about in the field of music, and also really in the field of technology and the development of technology throughout the 20th century, and the intersections of these two things. Obviously we've tread a lot of ground around the Grateful Dead and their sort of experiments with sound, and even like the mass psychological effects of music and sound and things like that.
Yeah.
The potential weaponization of art, especially in the context of the Cold War. But, when we were laying all that out, then, we start to take a few steps back in the historical record to see where our launching off point ought to be to really tackle this subject. And I think it's weird. I think it's particular to a lot of music subjects that I feel a greater pressure than in other things to really come correct. That's why, the only SJ episode that we've ever re-recorded was our part of Contra 7 about Credence, right?
Yes.
And I think that a lot of that was the internal pressure of feeling like, we didn't quite dig as hard as we needed to. And I know that there are people that are just passionate in their free time about reading about music lore, and it's like that thing when you're...
Was there never an episode that we just completely lost and had to do over again? I almost feel like, was there, like, way back early on? I know this is kind of like a tangent and not really the point you were making, but...
Yes, there was a part of one of the Hot Gaff series that we had to re-record, but that was because it got lost or corrupted or something. Like, it was a technical difficulty. This is like we could have released something, but we decided we had to go in harder. And I think it's the rule we generally try to... stick to, but especially music, because I know I'll get like messages afterwards being like, oh, you guys like mentioned this, but this is incorrect, or I can't believe you didn't bring up this, and stuff like that. And so, so as to avoid kicking ourselves in the future, after we release something, we figured, we got to do this right. So talking about, say, not just, if you're going to talk about raves, you have to talk about like the foundational ingredient of them. And I'm not talking about the drugs yet, but I'm talking about the electronic music, right? So then you always think, okay, to do something about like sus rave culture, you have to wind back at least to like the origins of electronic music. So then, I've been versing myself on that, and I think we will get to it. Of course, things like the origins of Detroit techno and Chicago house and Kraftwerk and Giorgio Moroder and all these things. Being a fan of these genres of music, I kind of know something about them. But then there's a further backstory with electronic music. It didn't just emerge out of the ether with Kraftwerk. This actually is something that was kind of an experimental phenomenon, really actually going back, I'd say, to the late 1800s.
Yeah.
But then really starting to pick up in the early 20th century. So I think what we quickly decided we needed to do was really wind back the clock and do a full history of synthesizers and electronic music instruments themselves, because they're relatively recent, in human history. In human civilization, barely a century.
When you've floated sus raves to me, I like how all of our like concepts for episodes now are just like sus blank, like sus like concept, unless it's like, obviously like it's not like susaron contra because that's like inherently sus, or like sus cryptids because they're also inherently sus, but like
true.
When you first floated that to me, I was like, all right, like that sounds like, it'll be good, or like a good topic, but like I wasn't super interested in it. I think mainly because I don't like dancing and I definitely don't like raves. So I didn't really have too much of like a window into it. But then when you like texted me later on saying like we actually should do like synthesizers first, I was like, that's pretty interesting. I was more excited about that. Like also because, I love old things, I love like intellectual history. So I was really like, I was like, oh, well, that goes back a ways. And it really is like at the intersection of two things we've kind of talked about a little bit, or of one thing that we talked about, I think, a fair amount, which is like radio and the unique influence of the development of radio upon like a lot of the sort of domains and institutions that we talk about, and what a massive social transformation radio was, and the power that radio continues to have as like an icon of the mass media. And this topic kind of really exists at the intersection of that and I guess like the history of like the sus piano.
The sus piano. Okay,
yeah.
I actually didn't go that far
or
back,
of like sus concert music. Well, it's interesting. Like, when I was kind of like sort of circling this topic, I think a lot of like crazy, interesting stuff about the history of electronic music like came up, but it was very interesting how, up until, what the invention of radio and the sort of real dawn of like mass electronic media, like with everyone having a radio like in their living room, what you would have in your house would be a piano. I mean, if you were like well off enough to afford a piano, if you had means to do it, that was like a big means of entertainment, like I think about like if you're like watching a Regency era set movie, like a Pride and Prejudice type thing, Jane Austen, a lot of the time a big draw for like the woman, and when she's being, seeking a husband, is her ability to play piano, because like before radio, that's like a huge source of entertainment, is like having someone in your house who can play piano. Well went through the Victorian era.
And you can entertain people with it, like in the Victorian era in the parlor room. Actually, like it was a very important thing. In fact, here's a funny family anecdote from the sus Irish side. My grandfather taught himself how to play piano, and he wanted to take lessons when he was a little kid, but because his Uncle Din learned how to play the piano and ended up playing in a saloon, and this is like, the late Victorian era, I guess my great-grandmother and the other women in the family thought that it was like dangerous to you know, they had like middle class affectation or aspirations or whatever, and they wanted to be lace curtain Irish and not shanty Irish. So he was not allowed to take piano lessons lest he end up working in like a whorehouse or like a saloon or something, like a sus place, like playing the piano,
playing
like
the
in
carnival
some Wild
organ,
West
like
movie.
Anton LaVey. Yeah.
So he had to teach himself, which he did eventually. But like, that was it was shocked because by the time I was a kid, that it was almost like more of like a lame thing to be like forced to take piano lessons by your parents, and like it was the most unthreatening thing imaginable. But of course, we were well into the rock and roll radio TV era by then. But no, it was a big thing. And like player pianos, which are almost a early kind of automated music technology. I forget, you found like a magazine that was talking about them. Was that like in the 1890s when they came out?
I think that might have been like a little bit later, like in the 20s. I'm not sure. I found a couple of them talking about like, you know, player pianos and like radio. But yeah, maybe around that time. Like, but yeah, like it's interesting how like a lot of the earliest radio equipment that people would have in their homes would like try to combine these two things in some way. And a big sort of takeaway, like something that was detractors would bring up about radio was that the piano didn't sound as good like on the radio as it did live. And so once you had like some kind of electronic or electric piano, like that was a huge breakthrough because that meant that you could transmit without any hammers or anything, you could transmit sounds directly to the radio or like, you know, through the radio lines or through the wires and everything, and you wouldn't have to rely on a microphone or anything like that. I mean, it's really crazy to think about like how socially transformative things like the phonograph and the early radio were, and everything around that.
And the telephone. I mean, we kind of downplay it now, but this really was kind of like the first internet. In a lot of ways.
It really was. Yeah.
Like you're sending wire, like either through wires or over wireless, like over like oscillated frequencies, you're sending out information like into the ether that they can get picked up. I mean, I think it's no coincidence, and a lot of people have pointed this out, that like, you know, the rise of like the age of like radio waves and electricity and telephones is also an age of like a huge interest in like spiritualism and theosophy and things like that were, and a lot of these, you know, I think a big draw of theosophy was like trying to find like scientific verification for a lot of these like more ethereal occult kind of concepts that in some cases were being borne out by real discoveries like of radio waves, electricity, radioactivity, X-rays, I guess, were a huge kind of cultural influence at the time for a lot of artists and painters and occultists. Actually, you know, I mean, often a huge overlap between all those, which we'll get into. But even I was surprised to read in all of these like early composers of like experimental electronic music how a lot of them were spellbound by like the invention of like X-ray photography. And I mean, you can almost think about it then, like when we talked about Kirlian photography in our Soviet parapsychology episode way back when, like it must have had a similar effect of like capturing this kind of ghostly, like, you know, translucent, like, you know, image of like a person and seeing into things that were previously hidden, right?
Yeah. Or previously, like, the ability to record things is like an incredibly like occult power. Like I mean, memory, you know, Francis Yates like wrote about this, has always been associated with like the occult and the power to like recall things prodigiously. That's like an occult power. So if you can, like, Edison, I think, had allegedly like taken some steps in the direction of inventing something called a necrophone, which could speak to the dead, you know, but in a way, like all sound recording devices can do something which is very profound in that way, which is like reproduce the voice of someone who's dead, which is crazy. Like, this is why, like, taking photographs and stuff like that, like, I remember reading an article recently about, like, the wax cylinder that's used to record the voice of someone reciting the Quran. Like, is that the Quran? And like, does it need to be like treated like reverentially, and all the sort of like fiqh issues around, the permissibility of photography and things like that. It's all like very interesting as like these different media develop, like people like don't quite know how to respond.
There's that old like legend about, I'm sure this is anecdotally true somewhere, but I feel like I've always heard about this when, anthropologists or whoever would go visit some tribe that had very limited kind of contact with like modern civilization, and whether this is like in Africa or South America, that some tribes were like very sussed out by like photographs being taken of them because they had an impression, like maybe when it was like explained to them what it did, that it was like somehow capturing their soul, that it was some kind of like infernal device that I don't know like how true. It's just something that I've heard like lazily referenced many times, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, that's definitely like something that you hear. But I think that like that is something that's like kind of, there's an intuitive logic to that. And I think that, it's being projected in that case, like onto like quote unquote primitive peoples.
Yeah, they're so simple, but I don't think that's such a
really
simple
like
idea. Like that's actually a kind of incited, like that's and
it's also something that a lot of people like believed kind of, that you could capture like spirits through photography in ways that you couldn't otherwise. Like there was a whole craze we talked about for spirit photography. And also like it really just goes back to the idea of creating like a graven image in some way, like if you're creating a photo duplicate of someone, like, something that doesn't have a spirit within it, sort of a hollow representation. There's like an uncanny valley element to it, like the idea that this double exists of you, and or of anybody, and doesn't has like sort of this body or this image without spirit. There's, something that people don't like it. It's
Now, Now, I'll just say, like, for my own personal bands, before we jump into the history here, that this topic, extends so wide and touches, reaches into, I think, every aspect of our lives. But even SJ itself is not sort of above and removed from this because. As any listeners of Demon Forces and a few other episodes, have been hearing, I've been composing a little bit of my own kind of ambient noise, electronic synthesizer music for this very show. And in my own personal subjective experience, I really like this these instruments and like what you're able to do with it, especially because you don't have to be sort of classically trained to put out basically make interesting sounds or like interesting songs basically, or soundscapes and things like that. I think I did like a year or two of piano lessons when I was a kid, and then I kind of dropped it. And I can kind of play guitar, but I'm really a Tom Fogerty, like, spiritual rhythm guitarist. Like, at the end of the day, like, if I'm, like, decent at anything, it's, like, chuglin or playing tasty, to a rhythm. But I'm not, like, a noodler. Maybe that's why I'm ignorant and I don't like Frank Zappa. But I'm just, like, I don't like the scales and all that Jerry Garcia shit, like, any type of it. Like, I'm like a Kurt Cobain, like Neil Young guitarist. So there's like a ceiling to like what I can achieve, like playing on a guitar. But then, like, I don't know, I think it was right after college, like 12 years ago, when a friend of mine was like, he was actually producing a lot of like dubstep, like before like Skrillex kind of ruined it. Like really like grimy British type shit. And I got kind of interested, like watching him do it, and then he told me to download Fruity Loops, and then I started playing around with Fruity Loops for the first time, and then I got like Logic and Reason, like back when you could pirate all these programs easily. And I don't know if you remember that. I think we were both living in New York back then, but I was tinkering a little bit with it and playing around, and like I've done that on and off for the years. And I think only more recently with like SJ have I kind of found a reason to like dive back into it. I think that's part of the reason why I've gotten more interested in kind of the background of like electronic music in general, particularly in the last year or so. And there's such a duality there of like things I genuinely like, and even I would consider kind of, genuinely this is like a step forward for humanity to be able to make these kind of sounds. But then, of course, there's always a shadow side to it as well. Mm-hmm. And, so I think that's all a long way of saying that, we're not coming here just to indict sus synthesizers and say that, they're satanic or something like that. However, there is some interesting history, like around like the earliest practitioners and kind of people that laid like the theoretical groundwork for like what would become electronic music. And I guess like so many other subjects, like at the end of the day, we find out that like it is not sort of this separate thing that was just developing on its own, but it's very interlocked with a lot of bigger developments and conflicts and things like that were going on like throughout the early 20th century, all the way up to being like literally sort of like components in like the Cold War, which is a whole kind of underexamined part of like electronic music history that, I found very fascinating. So, I guess maybe we should start somewhere.
Yeah.
Where do we start? I know you were looking at some older stuff, like player pianos and like amateur radio magazines. Is there anything from like the 1890s that you thought was kind of pertinent, like in terms of early inventions? I mean, it goes without saying, we might have to do a whole separate series one day just about sus radio, because like you're right, like it's such a we just have to put that in a box right now and say like sus radio came, it changed the world and like opened up all these things, and also like semi-sus electricity. The electricity does many great things, but also there's like the undeniable Promethean aspect of like the electrification of at least like the Western world at that point, and like the new opportunities it opened up. Actually, wait, sorry, one fact check. Maybe talking about Thomas Edison is good, but he did make like the necrophone. But I noticed in one book here, it was just mentioned offhandedly, that he was an avid theosophist. I don't remember encountering that specifically, but do you know, is that true?
I remember reading his sort of like bizarre ideas about, I forget exactly what they were, but it was in a past episode we read some like bizarre thing he had come up with, where it was like the transmission of intellect, like it was basically like kind of like the selfish gene, almost like genius particles like in people would like reproduce. Do you remember this? That's like the theosophical thing that or the sort of quasi occultic or like theosophical idea of his that I recall, which I feel like does have some like resonances with like Blavatsky type stuff. But I think, I don't know, maybe he was a member of a theosophical society. Apparently someone has alleged that, but I'm not sure like if it's true.
Yeah, I think it sounds, based on like the necrophone, he definitely had an interest in like spiritualist subjects. But that was one of the few things I didn't quite get to go back and like fact check, was like the degree to his involvement with Theosophy. But one of the reasons I was interested in that is because, surprise, surprise, like once again, it seems like, it's Theosophists all the way down in terms of like the development of like a world-changing technology that would come out, just like we talked about in psychedelics. And this does intersect with this story, like the early Silicon Valley kind of people that didn't they invent cathode ray tubes, and I mean like they invented some like very seminal things basically that kickstarted like Silicon Valley, sort of as we know it, right?
I'm just reading about Edison's theosophical associations now on the Theosophy wiki. According to Blavatsky, he was a member. Blavatsky said, Mr. Edison is a theosophist, although not a very active one. In her collected writings, it says that. Still, the very fact of his holding a diploma seems to inspire him with theosophical truths. And Blavatsky quoted him, this is what I think I was remembering. Edison, per Blavatsky, says, I do not believe that matter is inert, acted upon by an outside force. To me, it seems that every atom is possessed by a certain amount of primitive intelligence. Look at the 1,000 ways in which atoms of hydrogen combine with those of other elements. Do you mean to say they do this without intelligence? So...
Well, the big, I think, relevant theosophist idea that ended up being influential on a number of early, experimental sound people was this idea that everything is vibes based, like literally based on vibrations.
Yeah.
Right? And this is an idea that the theosophists pushed pretty hard, and is something that in a certain sense was kind of borne out by physics in, the 20th century, that, for example, that, both light and sound are waves, right?
Yeah, I mean, light wave nature, as we talked about in our Cope-Morhagen episodes, is controversial, but certainly it has some wave aspects. I think everyone would agree in its behavior. Yes. I mean, we have, the whole electromagnetic spectrum and stuff like that. So, this is what people were kind of talking about. And definitely Theosophists were into the idea of a sort of energy force, like an invisible energy force. Actually, this is a great and telling Blavatsky quote that kind of speaks to this and ties Edison together with Edward Bulwer Lytton, or, more famously known for his novel The Coming Race with Vril. Okay. Yeah, so... Absurd and unscientific as may appear our comparison of a fictitious vril invented by the great novelist, talking about this guy who wrote The Coming Race, and the primal force of the equally great experimentalist with the Kabbalistic astral light, it is nevertheless the true definition of this force. Discoveries are constantly being made to corroborate the statement thus boldly put forth. Since we began to write this part of our book, an announcement has been made in a number of papers of the supposed discovery of a new force by Mr. Edison, the electrician of Newark, New Jersey, which force seems to have little in common with electricity or galvanism, except the principle of conductivity. If demonstrated, it may remain for a long time under some pseudonymous scientific name, but nevertheless, it will be but one of the numerous family of children brought forth from the commencement of our time by our Kabbalistic mother, the Astral Virgin. In fact, the discoverer says that it is as distinct and has as regular laws as heat, magnetism, or electricity. The journal which contains the first account of the discovery adds that Mr. Edison thinks that it exists in connection with heat, and that it can also be generated by independent and as yet undiscovered means. I wonder what he was talking about. Radioactivity, maybe? I don't know.
Ether? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, maybe he just completely hallucinated this force, or, maybe it's something that we have yet to discover. But yeah, so he was going around saying that he discovered an entirely new force that was like electricity, but not.
Subtler than, almost sounds like Mesmer's ideas of something like subtler than ether,
Yeah, that's a pretty universal idea that everyone was into, the idea of some kind of subtle force. You can even go back to chi and stuff, the idea that there's an energy force among all people that can be manipulated. Even in Sufi writings, there's the idea of tasarruf, or influence, or it's literally means using. It's kind of ambiguous what's being used, a certain but yeah, it's some kind of spiritual energy that people use to make to affect the world in kind of an action at a distance type of way.
Now known as Riz, basically.
Yeah, kind of. But no, it can do sort of things that we would consider beyond the power of mere Riz,
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Yeah. Like a physical force that is undetectable by us, but actually influences us, and
that can be harnessed and used by people who are attuned to it to do things like read people's thoughts or have strength beyond the ordinary strength, things like that.
Exactly. And the Theosophists thought that like people that were imbued with like a certain like overabundance of maybe this energy were like more receptive to it. Like those were people who were like clairvoyants or
right. And you could train in it as well. But yeah, there are some people who are like better attuned to it. Yeah, literally, like, you know, you could make it a musical comparison.
Yeah, yeah. So, like, at the dawn of the 20th century, you had
and
all
this
these...
is also, sorry, just as a tangent, it's also kind of a, the connection with music is also, like, very apposite because there's always been kind of a connection between music and, like, spiritual state, you know? Like, the idea of, like, trance, like, which I guess, you know, that is generally electronic music. Like, the idea of going into a trance through music is, like, incredibly... ancient.
It's a very old idea. It's older, much older than the idea of art itself. Basically, this is almost a shamanic practice, you know.
Yeah, which, it's true. Like, I mean, arguably true. I mean, I guess it depends on what your definition of art is, but I mean, I guess maybe you could say that the idea of like a sort of secularized or like a very positivistic like idea of aesthetics that's like disconnected from any kind of like spiritual or dimension, like for lack of a better word, spiritual. But really, it's interesting because I think we're going to talk about this like in a different way later. But it's interesting how like that kind of dovetails with the like depoliticization of music and like the like considering it in kind of a social vacuum too, like is also this sort of way of just like thinking about just like the music per se, you know, in an artistic aesthetic sense, where it's just like, is this beautiful or whatever? Like, what are its musical qualities? What makes this pleasant to listen to? And not like the actual context, which like, you know, like for instance, just to use the context that I'm most familiar with, like in a Sufi context, like listening to music could be like halal or haram depending on the state of the person listening, right? I think we've talked about this before. Like it can sort of have a good reaction with someone who has a certain spiritual state, and in another, it can react with someone else in a way that is destructive. And people of different spiritual states react in different ways. Like someone might zone out and just meditate. Someone else might start sort of experiencing like ecstatic or frenetic dancing, right? So that's like I was just watching some videos of like the biggest Sufi order right now in Iraq. Like they're Qadiriya, I think is like their sub order of that. I think it's like Nazania, I want to say. Yeah, Nazania. I don't know if I'm saying their name right. I had to look at the Arabic, Nazania. But yeah, they do these like crazy sort of trance rituals where they like sort of headbang to music, and then they start sort of like poking skewers to their cheeks and like slamming like, you know, like hammering knives into their skulls and things like that. To sort of, you know.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I thought Burning Man was wild.
Yeah, it's more intense than that. It's an interesting.
That's interesting.
Group.
So could you say that by that logic, people could be at like a hard techno rave or even a Grateful Dead show, and somebody there could be jamming to the Grateful Dead on Hawk, and the other person is like shirking out like next to them because of the different like headspaces they're in?
That would be typical of the discourse around music and listening. But, well, you know, it depends really, like, again, because there's different discourses and there's sort of variation within them. You know, it also has to do with the kind of people who are around you. But, like, in a very orthodox sort of discourse, you would probably discourage, like, fraternizing with people who are disreputable if you were trying to sort of, because there's always a defensive aspect to it, right? Whenever there's these kind of things that are vulnerable to the critique that thematizes innovation or bid'ah, then you want to defend yourself and shore up your Islamic legitimacy. So you're trying to distance yourself from those people as much as possible. So then you're going to say like, oh, you know, you're going to criticize people who do that. But of course, then there are also people who would sort of act in the way that you're talking about. Like we did an episode on Manaqib al-Arifin, and there's like a great anecdote in that where Rumi is sort of dancing with like a bunch of dogs, which like, you know, kind of symbolize a lot of the time in like Persian and Sufism, like, you know, lowness and like filth. But like, in his like dancing with the dogs, he has like a greater spiritual exaltation. I'd have to look up the actual passage because I can't reproduce it off my head, but he like chastises people for like admonishing the dogs because the dogs actually like are more attuned to like his state and his circumstance and his station than other people are. So that kind of, and there's also kind of the this could be a long tangent, but there's also kind of the thing where you want to in some ways associate yourself with, because showing off is so deprecated, you want to associate yourself with people who are viewed negatively because for various reasons there's like a very strong anti-showing off discourse, right? Of course that then creates cover for doing it, where you're like, oh, I'm doing this on purpose, I'm doing something that seems bad on purpose so that then I will appear like my pride will be diminished, and I won't be seen as this spiritual person, I'll be seen as someone who's dissolute, and that actually has spiritual rewards, like being seen as low by others. But anyway,
it's a little bit like Jesus, hanging out with the hookers and the beggars and everything. Like it kind of ended up being a positive for him, but probably normatively in that society at that time, that was seen as like, what, like a respected rabbi doesn't go hang out with hookers,
exactly. Like there's actually like a really let me see if I can like quickly dig it up, but there's like a great story about Ibn al-Farid, who's like, there's still like sort of crazy Maulid or birthday sort of celebrations at his shrine in Cairo that go on today. I'm gonna see if I can get into this. I'm not sure if I can. And yeah, there's all sorts of like trance-based or intense dancing that goes on around it. I would like to read this passage, but I'm having trouble accessing it. But basically the story is that like he's just walking through the marketplace and he hears two guards. And in the telling of the story, the guards, it's ambiguous whether they are Christians or Muslims. The story actually says like maybe they were chanting this or singing it, or maybe they were, Muslims and they were just kind of like poetically, rhythmically saying these lines. But it's, something like, oh, my master, like, we petitioned you for union, but you refused us, so we slept in illusion. And when he hears these lines, he just like leaves his body, like he goes, into like basically an ecstatic state is what you would say. And he starts, kind of like stripping off all of his clothes and getting naked.
Wow.
And he and then, it has a sort of contagious aspect to it where everyone around him starts to act in the same way, and they start to, kind of rave and go crazy with him too. And eventually, he leads like a procession to the congregational mosque, and he then once he gets there, he just like drops dead, and he lies in that state as if he were a corpse for like 3 days or something. And like he seems like he's dead. And they're like, they put a blanket over him and he just lies there like a corpse for 3 days. And then eventually he wakes up and there's like guardsmen who are like, here are your clothes. Like, can you take these? And he's like, no, I don't want them anymore. And he just I guess leaves. It's not clear, but he just leaves.
Wow.
And the guardsmen, then it's stated that they either kept those clothes for their own use because they had like baraka, they had like special energy like accrued in them, or they sold them to people so that, they could make a profit like for, selling these sort of numinous objects. So that's like an example of how this can happen. But there you can even see the kind of protective orthodoxizing discourse on that, because he didn't seek out that experience. It happened incidentally because he was walking around and then he just happened to hear it, So that's a different setting from like a Sufi concert.
To Dead and Company.
Yeah, and also in the whole situation of like, oh, maybe they were Christian singers, or maybe they were just Muslims who were chanting poetry, that isn't music, right? And this is all around the whole thing of like, what even is music, right? Because the Quran, even though its recitation obviously has melodic qualities, it's not considered to be music, even though like something else that had similar qualities might be considered that. So there's this whole sort of discourse there as well. But in short, to answer what you're saying, like, yeah, there's even that, I think we even mentioned it in the Menachem Arafin episode, there's that sort of line from that hagiographical text, which is, the hand raised in, like, genuine ecstasy that will guarantee you paradise, but the hand that's raised in false ecstasy will guarantee you hellfire. Right?
Oh my God!
So,
Wow,
yeah.
That's like the core of every argument of like a real techno head that like despises EDM. Is like a fist pumped in false ecstasy will send you to hell in a bucket, but like a fist pumped to like Juan Atkins will send you to heaven.
Yeah,
which I don't disagree with, actually. But, to kind of stick here in the beginning, just to mention, though I think we have to really dig into it another day, it was Thomas Edison that invented the phonograph. And then, I guess, in conjunction with Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, kind of improved upon it and made it a thing. I think the first one was invented in, I want to say, 1877. And the Volta laboratory of Alexander Graham Bell improved it in the 1880s and introduced the graphophone. And then in the 1890s, Emil Berliner initiated the transition from phonograph cylinders to flat discs with a spiral groove. And I think, the phonograph record then kind of came out of that, like the vinyl record. But in the beginning of, the 20th century, you didn't have very much like experimentation. Well, I mean, you had a little bit of it going on with like composers and stuff. But in watching some of these documentaries about the history of, experimental and electronic music, an early name that I kept seeing pop up that had a lot of like conceptual influence throughout the 20th century was this Italian gentleman, Luigi Russolo, from the 1910s.
Yeah, this is interesting. And we found a very interesting book about
We did, but it kind of blew open some stuff about him. Because I think it was in like this 90s documentary that we'll probably talk about in a later installment called Modulations, Cinema for the Ear, kind of a strange title. But that one it's like a very We Live in Public, like late 90s, like Y2K, like, this is the rave scene today, but also going back in the history. And it keeps quoting like these little, one-liners from Luigi Russolo. And a few people are talking about how influential he was. And I guess today he is kind of regarded to some extent as the forefather of what you might call noise music. This is closely related to his involvement with the Italian Futurists. Even though he was primarily a painter and he only got into kind of musical experimentation like after establishing himself as kind of an artist, as a visual artist. Then, in like the 1910s, he started veering into like a more experimental territory around sound. And really, I think, applying a lot of like the philosophical ideas that were floating around with futurism and like, painting and the visual arts, and saying, well, why doesn't this apply to music as well? And, in 1913, he wrote this manifesto that would end up being, I think it was influential at the time, but it would end up being very influential like decades down the road when people actually started messing around with experimental and electronic music. And did you get to read the Art of Noise manifesto?
Yeah, I read some of it. I don't think I read the entire thing because it was pretty long, but I did read some of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty short, but
Really?
I was kind
the
of
wrong thing.
It was only 16 pages. I think well, the other thing we read, which kind of blows open a lot, is this book from, I think, like 2012, this academic book called Luigi Russolo, Futurist.
Oh, yeah,
Noise,
I did
Visual
read
Arts,
that.
and the Occult.
Yeah,
that is...
I feel like I was reading some other like long manifesto that was from like the time period, but yeah.
Was it the fascist manifesto that he had a hand in writing years later?
Oh, the Futurist manifesto?
Oops, sorry. Yeah, I think it was
which is basically a fascist manifesto. Yeah, which is very underappreciated fact. Yeah, I mean, maybe I was reading something adjacent to that, but I remember like seeing this as like just a really long tirade. Yeah, the Art of Noise is much shorter. Yeah, I'm looking at it now.
This book, Luigi Russolo, Futurist. I'm forgetting the name of the author. Let me just bring him up here.
Luciano Cessa.
Oh, Luciano Cessa. Yeah, and this came out in 2012, and I was surprised because I'd already been seeing some like Theosophy stuff, and I'm watching this documentary from like the 90s, and of course, big, electronic music pioneer Genesis Peorage is like a talking head in it, and kind of talking about
Ferruccio Bessoni's sketch of a new aesthetic of music.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so no, I didn't get to read that.
That's also interesting. All right. Anyway, sorry, keep going.
But it was interesting because like obviously, it sounds like there's some heady, futurist kind of concepts going on with Russolo, but like the word Theosophy never comes up in that documentary as like an aspect of who this guy was, and in fact, reading a lot about him, it's, if anything, it's like a minor footnote, but this book by Luciano Cessa, Noise, Visual Arts, and the Occult, really, like, its main purpose is to hammer home the idea that Luigi Russolo was a hardcore theosophist pretty much throughout his entire career and like a spiritualist, and that these kind of interests basically are shot through all of his work.
Yeah.
It's very clear in looking at like his drawings and his paintings, like there's a lot of like kind of spooky sort of symbolism going on, and also like an obsession with, I actually didn't know that Theosophists were so obsessed with this, but they all were obsessed with synesthesia, like the idea that sounds have colors. He was very obsessed with that.
Kandinsky gets mentioned a lot, and he was someone who was like super into that. In fact, I think that he wrote like I want to say he wrote like an entire like manifesto about like the importance of like synesthesia.
I think he did.
Yeah.
And as this scholar points out, like for some reason in all the scholarship about Russolo in like the mid 20th century onwards, pretty much all the scholars and people like just cut out the fact that he was a theosophist, or like deeply minimized it as like, oh well, he was just kind of like, he got a little eccentric when he was older. He had like, just like how he had a fascist phase, like he had a little bit of a spiritualist phase, but this scholar is like, no, like basically their entire output is deeply inflected with like theosophist thought and like intention and all that stuff. And when I started, reading his actual manifesto, it's like, it's pretty obvious. So it's like weird that they minimize it so much. I guess they thought that it doesn't make it makes him, people would regard him as not serious enough if like
it's actually
they
an interesting this part of the introduction, because I think there's so many parallels like between this and the way that like other artists from the same period, really the futurists in general, like are treated. Like I feel like the Futurist Manifesto is something that is taught in like the history of art, like classes on like the like theater history or art history, and like it's just kind of like glossed over like how incredibly fascist it was sometimes. And I feel this way like Antonin Artaud is someone who like, I don't think that he was even as fascist as Russolo, but there's a great book that I probably recommended on the podcast before, Artaud and His Doubles. Not Theater and Its Double, which is his book, but there's a book called Artaud and His Doubles. I'm calling him Artaud, but Artaud and his doubles, and it's kind of about like the sort of fascist or reactionary potentialities of some of his ideas that have kind of been glossed over because of his like incredible lionization and like reception in like by the avant-garde, like the general like European and American avant-garde. And this book like really makes it seem like Russolo is a similar case. Like it says. The reason for the lack of critical attention to Russolo's occult work is ideological. Interest in the occult has been ignored by scholars whose modernist approach to musicology accepts and rewards only contributions that can be considered progressive according to a narrow, selective, and fundamentally ideological idea of progress in art. That's an incredibly true sentence. That
Definitely.
If someone is a meaningful, important figure in like the development of art, like Artaud, they either need to get like laundered into being like a leftist, which is really what happened with Russolo, or they need to be ignored. Most likely this judgment is also based on a fear of the supposed connection between irrational occult theories and fascism. Russolo's documented involvement, this is like a great case study of this. Russolo's documented involvement with fascism has until now been erased from Russolo's scholarship. His participation in the Duce-endorsed Futurist exhibit at Turin's Quadrennial in May 1927 has been thoroughly suppressed, as has his involvement with the exhibit at Milan's Pesaro Gallery in October 1929. His fascist connection is further covered up with the designation anti-fascist, with Giovanni Lista first applied to him in 1975. Lista supported this designation with a number of disputable post-World War II testimonies, and he claimed that in 1927, Russolo voluntarily went into exile in Paris to protest fascism. What led Russolo to Paris were professional opportunities, not politics. In fact, his permanent return to Italy in 1933, as well as some of his subsequent writings, signal first acceptance of and then allegiance to the fascist regime. Yet the fable of his anti-fascism runs through all of Russolo's scholarship. It is still maintained in Tagia Pietra, 2007, and Lista, 2009, with no convincing evidence to support it. So that, I think, is something that...
It's pretty wild. Yeah. You do see that with a number of figures. Like, I think you see it with kind of wasn't Ezra Pound a huge fascist? And,
Luigi Pirandello is a great example. The guy who wrote 6 Characters in Search of an Author. Right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, maybe you've read that in like a theater history course or early 20th century theater. It's an important modernist work of theater. It's kind of meta and everything. So it's something that people teach a lot. No one ever talks about how this guy was literally incredibly fascist. I think one time someone even kind of tried to give him an out and asked him in an interview if he was 100% fascist or something, and he said, "I'm 200% fascist."
Why do they all say that? What's his name from Japan was I am the world's richest fascist. And then Licio Gelli was I am a super fascist. They can't just be a fascist.
Yeah.
They absolutely love it. They have to be a mega fascist, an ultra fascist. 200%. I mean, God. So yeah, he's not exactly beating the fascist allegations, and nor is he really beating the theosophist and occult allegations, basically, as this book really not only kind of goes into Russolo, but then points out the kind of theosophist occult influence on multiple people in the Italian futurist movement. So, why are they trying so hard to cover it up that the Theosophy to Fash pipeline is
because
potentially real?
Artists these days are, people who like avant-garde art and who are, intellectuals or sympathetic to in American politics. I mean, I won't necessarily speak for Europe. Maybe there's a different sort of phenomenon there. It's, because I've noticed it more acutely reading in English, but maybe it's not as perceptible in other contexts. But my feeling on it is that, especially in America, where the right wing generally has an anti-intellectual streak, with some obvious exceptions, academic institutions and things like that, and also it's not like there's people running out to start a MAGA theater company in Brooklyn or something, or anywhere,
true. You can't roll up with that MAGA shit,
or
in,
even a
the
Bronze
arts
Age
community.
pervert. I guess Dime Square would be the biggest exception, where people are making kind of reactionary or fascist sympathetic art, and
even they don't have a broad audience outside of fascist edgelords online and maybe a few bougie people who like to to feel dangerous, like every now and then, you know.
And it's interesting to talk about how there's like actually an avant-garde lineage there, that they're probably some of the more intellectually or historically inclined people in that group probably are very self-consciously trying to tap into. But anyway, yeah, like definitely it's true that like art is considered to be, I don't know, like effeminate or weak, and like therefore the right wing tends to shun it unless it's like, you know, very kind of like The Sound of Freedom or something like that, which doesn't necessarily, it's more agitprop, you know, it doesn't have kind of like artistic aspirations. You know, I just think people know what I'm talking about. Yeah, people know what I'm talking about. Like that.
Absolutely.
And like they want it to be provincial, you know, they don't want to make like the artsy fartsy, you know, like Sound of Freedom, you know what I mean? Like they wouldn't want to do that. Like they wouldn't like, it's a different sort of system of like aesthetic and political values. So I think that like, there's a strong
like try
connection
that in a small
between
town,
yeah,
like Nashville country kind of fills that one of those niches.
Yeah, there's a strong connection between, you know, and I think that's also why like there's so much outrage in the American culture war, is because like of the perceived like domination of like left wing or liberal politics of like the domain of the arts, right? And like if there's like a premium TV show that's like well acted or well written, you know, they don't like it because it outrages people because, you know, there's glimmers of these kind of like liberal politics and things like that. But regardless, like I think that people, like, you know, without belaboring the point, people know what I'm talking about, like that there's a sympathy between like academia and artistic institutions and the political left in the United States specifically, probably true other places as well. And because of that, they don't want to. And like some of these people who are incredibly influential, like Artaud, great example, are like they're heroes. You know, they revolutionize or were incredibly influential. They learned about them in school at this point. You know, like they're the people who created so many of these important ideas that they draw upon, right? So they, like, for them to be in some way tainted by promoting fascism, like that's an intolerable idea. Like, you know, whether they can acknowledge it under pressure, they're certainly not going to, like, they certainly have a lot of incentive not to, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
exactly. Yeah. And also I think it's worth it, I think definitely at this point, but even by probably the mid 20th century, like the 60s and 70s, that these art schools that were very influential that produced that type of person that you're talking about, like the liberal elitist kind of art person or, you know, humanities person that would never want to be seen like, you know, standing a fascist like thinker or artist. Like these are really liberal. We say left, but we really mean like left liberal, right? Because I think there's even connections between like who funded these programs, who endowed them with money, with these foundations that were running around that, you know, were pretty much the primary bankrollers of the arts, as well as the sort of establishment liberal kind of like federal government programs like the NEA to some extent. But they were already kind of conditioned in a way by people that had their own like liberal complicities with Nazism in a certain type, whether it was financial or whether they were all eugenicists, open eugenicists 20 years prior, but then kind of like chilled out on it after the war. People like Julian Huxley, you know, I mean, and even that whole kind of clique of like Anglo-American, like Fabian socialist types that kind of, you know, were, in retrospect, I feel like kind of angling towards like a Huxleyan Brave New World kind of dystopia, but for them it would be a utopia because they'd be on top. You know, kind of like this like technological and psychological like recreation of like the Indian caste system for like the Western world where like we would use eugenics and drugs to like stratify society and like blah, blah, blah. Like they're, you know, like all these art programs. And also I think even though to some extent academia was like a little bit of a refuge for some people that might have been really like hardcore like Marxists or like communists, I'd say after the Red Scare got done with it, you know, that those people were few and far between and were not, you know, maybe they had a lot of juice in the 30s, but like by the 50s and 60s, a lot of them were probably driven out of the academy or not given the same funding as like apolitical artists, like say like Jackson Pollock, you know. So I think there's also like that dynamic going on too, where like maybe like they've been conditioned into like giving like making excuses for Nazis and like but in their case, you really have to lean on like, no, actually they were an anti-fascist or something. And you can't say like, no, actually like they were based and it was right that they loved fascism. Like that's not going to fly. So they got to be like, no, actually, it's like how Orwell is like a based socialist, even though he was like a fucking like anti-Soviet like snitch, like piece of shit propagandist or whatever, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can see that there are probably some people who just like totally agree with Orwell's politics, and like it's not like they're being deceived. Like, whereas in some cases, I feel like people genuinely like refuse to accept like what the politics of like certain influential figures, like in the history of like theater or music, like believed. I think it's because like I don't know. There's also I think particularly it affects writing about art or like art criticism, and also like the production of art itself. Almost more so than like the general, I don't know, like the humanities or whatever you want to say. Like, because I think like in the latter case, you can kind of have like a critical distance up to a point, even though like not really. Like, this is like, it's really, not saying very much to say that you have less critical, distance than the academic humanities, but, or less self-reflexivity. But I think that weirdly, nowadays, this is just, my kind of intuitive feeling, this is not necessarily backed by stats. And I get definitely what you're saying about like the depoliticization of, and I think this is in a way a symptom of some of those same trends that you were pointing out. It's like Jackson Pollock or, abstract expressionism when there's no political content, things like that. Like, I feel like nowadays, like people do very much see art, and if they're writing about art or what they're like kind of producing like theoretical work about art in the same way that, it was for the futurists and everything, they see it as being connected to like a political project, right? And they see like the people who they like their interlocutors, the people who they're writing about or describing this narrative of history is, like this author, Luciana Chessa said, like it's a narrative of progress, right? It's a progressive narrative of like, these people were fighting across time in the name of like, bread and roses or whatever, and like I'm in an alliance with like these great people from the past, and like I can't give any nuance to their ideas. You know what I mean? Like they need to be like, and you can see this phenomenon across. Yeah, exactly. They need to be like heroes because like that this is part of this grand narrative that like I believe, like I believe in, I'm standing in right now, like where I'm somehow like standing on the shoulders of like these people, and like to think that like, to really kind of say like, okay, like what did they actually believe? Like, especially where in this sort of nebulous domain of art where like art needs to have subtlety, needs to have complexity, and it also needs to be accessible, right? So, like a lot can get sort of hairy there.
Yeah.
I think that's why people, they just can't deal with it. I don't know. Like they just can't.
It complicates things too much, and it is funny when you read like Russolo's writings from that era that he's writing in a very polemical fashion, and I think it's easy to kind of like filter that through today and be like he was like a partisan for like the purity of art or something. But like he was also kind of like talking about the whole totality of everything in society, and eventually he found his like best expression through kind of working with like Mussolini and the fascists. Like that was the lane that he thought was his art should be kind of like channeled into, and that's where he channeled it. But at the same time, like people look back on it today and I'm like, oh well, whatever. Like separate the entire life of the artist from the art or the art theory, and just like appreciate what he was talking about. And like to a certain extent, like like you said, like in context, like certain things can be gleaned, I guess. But I also think it kind of does a disservice to like delete two very big influences on his life, or things that were defined his life, which were like Italian fascism or futurism bleeding into fascism, and then also Theosophy, and to deny both those things, like then you can start manipulating what this guy, what his historical role was, and like what his sort of theories actually mean. You can kind of like strip it for parts and use it instrumentally.
Yeah. And I think even more broadly than that, part of the problem is that like it's this like reflex is like, okay, well, we can sort this person in with like the baddies, but then it's this sort of like Manichaean kind of thing, where it's like, okay, baddies and goodies, which does not work for intellectual history because it's simply too messy, and once you say like, okay, fine, this person was fascist, they're with the baddies, then oh no, like, but all of their friends were like this guy, and like, next thing you know, it's like this beloved like leftist like was also like engaging with like these ideas, and things like that, was influenced by like Theosophy is a great example of something that was a substrate between these two things. And you have to accept the fact that there was cross-pollination, like that these groups like were interacting with each other, that these networks intersected, like there are like the good, like it's much grayer than like goodies and baddies, like when it comes to the intellectual history of it. And that is something that I feel like people can't face because they need the goodies for like their political project in the present to like build it upon, And so then that ends up just sanitizing everyone, like.
I would imagine even that a bunch of like fascists or maybe like BAP fans or whatever, like if they did stan Luigi Russolo, they wouldn't want to hear about how he's obsessed with like Theosophy. Like that's cringe, It's like, no, he was a based fascist who like believed in blah blah blah. You know what I mean? Like, and I mean maybe deep down they're all Theosophists too.
Like some theosophical ideas, but I guess a woman basically was like the main exponent of
a
Theosophy.
Jewish woman.
So I feel like that would be But then again, BAP is allegedly Jewish, so
he is. So yeah, he was like tutored by Zionists at Yale. But so it's hard to figure out what's really going on. But I think you could see that, like even for all kinds of camps, like this guy, like the Theosophist elephant in the room, once again, is the thing that like nobody wants to talk about, but it's like worth talking about or bringing in as valuable context. Now, I just want to read a little bit from the Art of Noise manifesto. I have a version that was printed in English by Something Else Press in 1967. I don't know if this is in UK or in the US or both. But I assume, a propitious time for this to come out again in 1967, right? The Summer of Love and the British mod scene, like all this stuff popping off. So there are some points or some rants that he makes in here about like noises and about quote unquote pure sounds and like traditional music and stuff. This is really like an angry like Substack post against quote unquote classical music, and I find it striking because it does feel very legitimately prophetic. I mean, we can talk afterwards about like, well, what's he really getting at and what will the consequences be, but just want to share it because like this is stuff that when he was getting into his experimental music phase, like this is the clearest distillation of like what he's going for and his ideas around music. So he's writing to another futurist, Balila Pratella, who was like a trained composer. Yeah, so he writes, "My dear Balila Pratella, great futurist musician, on March 9th, 1913, during our bloody victory over 4,000 passeists in the Costanzi Theater of Rome, we were fist and cane fighting in defense of your futurist music, performed by a powerful orchestra, when suddenly in my intuitive mind conceived a new art that only your genius can create. The art of noises, logical consequence of your marvelous innovations. In antiquity, life was nothing but silence. Noise was really not born before the 19th century, with the advent of machinery. Today, noise reigns supreme over human sensibility. For several centuries, life went on silently or mutedly. The loudest noises were neither intense, nor prolonged, nor varied. In fact, nature is normally silent, except for storms, hurricanes, avalanches, cascades, and some exceptional telluric movements. This is why man was thoroughly amazed by the first sounds he obtained out of a hole in reeds or a stretched string. Primitive people attributed to sound a divine origin. It became surrounded with religious respect and reserved for the priests, who thereby enriched their rites with a new mystery. Thus was developed the conception of sound as something apart, different from and independent of life. The result of this was music, a fantastic world superimposed upon reality, an inviolable and sacred world. This hieratic atmosphere was bound to slow down the progress of music, so the other arts forged ahead and bypassed it. The Greeks, with their musical theory mathematically determined by Pythagoras, according to which only some consonant intervals were admitted, have limited the domain of music until now and made almost impossible the harmony they were unaware of. Middle Ages music did progress through the development and modifications of the Greek tetrachord system, but people kept considering sound only in its unfolding through time, a narrow conception so persistent that we still find it in the very complex polyphonies of the Flemish composers. The chord did not yet exist. The development of the different parts was not subordinated to the chord that these parts could produce together. The conception of these parts was not vertical, but merely horizontal. The need for and the search for simultaneous union of different sounds, that is to say of its complex, the chord, came gradually. The assonant common chord was followed by chords enriched with some random dissonances, to end up with the persistent and complicated dissonances of contemporary music. First of all, musical art looked for the soft and limpid purity of sound. Then it amalgamated different sounds, intent upon caressing the ear with suave harmonies. Nowadays, musical art aims at the shrilliest, strangest, and most dissonant amalgams of sound. Thus, we are approaching, and he puts in bold, noise sound. This revolution of music is paralleled by the increasing proliferation of machinery sharing in human labor. In the pounding atmosphere of great cities, as well as in the formerly silent countryside, machines create today such a large number of varied noises that pure sound, with its littleness and its monotony, now fails to arouse any emotion. To excite our sensibility, music has developed into a search for a more complex polyphony and a greater variety of instrumental tones and coloring. It has tried to obtain the most complex succession of dissonant chords, thus preparing the ground for, all bold, musical noise. Okay. This evolution toward noise sound is only possible today. The ear of an 18th century man never could have withstood the discordant intensity of some of the chords produced by our orchestras, whose performers are 3 times as numerous. On the other hand, our ears rejoice in it, for they are attuned to modern life, rich in all sorts of noises. But our ears, far from being satisfied, keep asking for bigger acoustic sensations. However, musical sound is too restricted in the variety and the quality of its tones. The most complicated orchestra can be reduced to 4 or 5 categories of instruments with different sound tones: rubbed string instruments, pinched string instruments, metallic wind instruments, wooden wind instruments, and percussion instruments. Music marks time in this small circle and vainly tries to create a new variety of tones. Again in bold, we must break at all costs from this restrictive circle of pure sounds and conquer the infinite variety of noise sounds. Each sound carries with it a nucleus of foreknown and foregone sensations, predisposing the auditor to boredom, in spite of all the efforts of innovating composers. All of us have liked and enjoyed the harmonies of the great masters. For years, Beethoven and Wagner have deliciously shaken our hearts. Now we are fed up with them. Again in bold, this is why we get infinitely more pleasure imagining combinations of the sounds of trolleys, autos, and other vehicles, and loud crowds, than listening once more, for instance, to the heroic or pastoral symphonies. It is hardly possible to consider the enormous mobilization of energy that a modern orchestra represents without concluding that the acoustic results are pitiful. And this is actually pretty funny. This whole paragraph, he really goes in. Mm-hmm. Is there anything more ridiculous in the world than 20 men slaving to increase the plaintive meowing of violins? This plain talk will make all music maniacs jump in their seats, which will stir up a bit the somnolent atmosphere of concert halls. Shall we visit one of them together? Let's go inside one of these hospitals for anemic sounds. See, the first bar is dripping with boredom stemming from familiarity and gives you a foretaste of the boredom that will drip from the next bar. In this fashion, we sip from bar to bar 2 or 3 sorts of boredom and keep waiting for the extraordinary sensation that will never materialize. Meanwhile, we witness the brewing of a heart-rending mixture composed of the monotony of the sensations and the stupid and religious swooning of the audience, drunk on experiencing for the 1000th time, with almost Buddhist patience, with elegant and fashionable ecstasy, and this is in all caps, Pua! Let's get out quickly, for I can't repress much longer the intense desire to create a true musical reality finally by distributing big loud slaps right and left, stepping and pushing over violins and pianos, bassoons and moaning organs. Let's go out! Some will object that noise is necessarily unpleasant to the ear. The objection is futile, and I don't intend to refute it, to enumerate all the delicate noises that give pleasant sensations. To convince you of the surprising variety of noises, I will mention thunder, wind, cascades, rivers, streams, leaves, a horse trotting away, the starts and jumps of a carriage on the pavement, the white solemn breathing of a city at night, all the noises made by feline and domestic animals, and all those man's mouth can make without talking or singing. Let's walk together through a great modern capital, with the ear more attentive than the eye, and we will vary the pleasures of our sensibilities by distinguishing among the gurglings of water, air, and gas inside metallic pipes, the rumblings and rattlings of engines breathing with obvious animal spirits, the rising and falling of pistons, the stridency of mechanical saws, the loud jumping of trolleys on their rails, the snapping of whips, the whipping of flags. We will have fun imagining our orchestration of department stores' sliding doors, the hubbub of the crowds, the different roars of railroad stations, iron foundries, textile mills, printing houses, power plants, and subways. And we must not forget the very new noises of modern warfare. And then he quotes like a crazy stream of consciousness poem from a guy writing from a war in Bulgaria.
Is this where he quotes Marinetti?
Yeah, Marinetti. Yeah. The poet Marinetti.
Who was like the real big futurist guy who basically wrote the Futurist Manifesto, which is very, very nakedly fascist.
I mean, the way this guy kind of gets off on the sounds of warfare definitely sounds a little bit like, just to read two lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, the siege cannons gut the silence by a cord, tum-tum. Immediately echoes, 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 all echoes quick. Take it, crumble it, spread it, infinite distance to hell. In the center of these flattened tatums with 50 square kilometers, leap, 2, 3, 6, 8 splinters, fisticuffs, head rammings, rapid-fire batteries, violence, ferocity, regularity, pendulum game, fatality. This grave base, apparent slowness. Scan the strange madmen, very young, very mad, 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 very agitated altos of the battle fury. Anyways, yeah, you get the idea. He is pretty about there is a musicality to modern warfare and industrial society itself. I mean, basically right here, he is kind of predicting what would eventually become all kinds of electronic music, but particularly industrial music, right?
Yeah.
Which Genesis Peorage was one of the really originators of. But you could argue that Kraftwerk dabbled in it in some of their mid-'70s records as well, and some other experimental, we'll talk about that soon, but there was a lot of experimental people a few decades after this that started to get into that. So, he goes on to talk about how each noise possesses a pitch, and, it has these irregular vibrations, and that they should be kind of manipulated in a way and combined with other things and other pitches and stuff to create a totally new type of music. And I forget if he says here, no, he doesn't talk about trains in this, but somebody else talked about trains and how trains are positive, the sound of a train.
They certainly are.
No, I mean, we're gonna get into a lot of train worship in the history of electronic music.
Well,
to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, if you really look at the Futurist manifestos that Marinetti wrote throughout his career, it's much more just in the manifesto, the founding manifesto of futurism. He wrote, he has this bulleted list where he says, 1, we intend to sing the love of danger, the habit of energy and fearlessness. 2, courage, audacity, and revolt will be essential elements of our poetry. 3, up to now, literature has exalted a pensive immobility, ecstasy, and sleep. We intend to exalt aggressive action, a feverish insomnia, the racer's stride, the mortal leap, the punch and the slap. So it's all kind of abstract right now, but, so I'm going to skip a little bit ahead, but so 7, except in struggle, there is no more beauty. No work without an aggressive character can be a masterpiece. Poetry must be conceived as a violent attack on unknown forces, to reduce and prostrate them before man. 8, we stand on the last promontory of the centuries. Why should we look back on what we want us to break down the mysterious doors of the impossible? Time and space died yesterday. We already live in the absolute because we have created eternal, omnipresent speed. 9, we will glorify war, the world's only hygiene, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of freedom bringers, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and scorn for woman. 10. We will destroy the museums, libraries, academies of every kind. We will fight moralism, feminism, every opportunistic or utilitarian cowardice. 11. We will sing of great crowds excited by work, by pleasure, and by riot. We will sing of the multicolored, polyphonic tides of revolution in the modern capitals. We will sing of vibrant nightly fervor of arsenals and shipyards blazing with violent electric moons, greedy railway stations that devour smoke-plumed serpents, factories hung on clods by the crooked lines of their smoke, bridges that stride the rivers like giant gymnasts, flashing in the sun with the glitter of knives, adventurous steamers that sniff the horizon, deep-chested locomotives whose wheels paw the tracks like the hooves of enormous steel horses bridled by tubing, and the sleek flight of planes whose propellers chatter in the wind like banners and seem to cheer like an enthusiastic crowd. So, yeah, you kind of get
the
again,
energy,
early
yeah.
on, you can kind of see how, like, that almost could be, like, some sort of like I don't know, like Brecht or something, or like some like someone associated with that, like I don't know, like Piscator. Like you could almost see like this being some kind of like leftist thing of like, you know, embracing industrialization and art, like something like that, you know, like and then slowly, and that's like kind of how I think some of the historiography of futurism, shockingly, like does kind of deal with it, and I think that there's. Yeah,
all of them were heckin' leftists. Like,
well, you know, I feel like it's so futurism is like such a transparent case that it's not like that bad, but there are definitely wedge cases. Like, I mean, Russolo is an example where he was like being regarded as an anti-fascist, despite being like, this is the best thing that, or like, you know, the best example that Marinardi wrote about. You know, his support for fascism and for sort of war in general, discussing the war in Ethiopia, right? He says, For 27 years, we futurists have rebelled against the idea that war is anti-aesthetic. We therefore state, war is beautiful because, thanks to its gas mask, its terrifying megaphones, its flamethrowers, and light tanks, it establishes man's dominion over the subjugated machine. War is beautiful because it inaugurates the dreamed-of metallization of the human body. War is beautiful because it enriches a flowering meadow with the fiery orchids of machine guns. War is beautiful because it combines gunfire barrages, ceasefires, scents, and the fragrance of putrefaction into a symphony. War is beautiful because it creates new architectures like those of armored tanks, geometric squadrons of aircrafts, spirals of smoke from burning villages, and much more. Poets and artists of futurism, remember these principles of an aesthetic of war, that they may illuminate your struggles for a new poetry and a new sculpture.
Okay, that sounds like some BAP shit right there. Yeah, like just kind of, war is based in Chad.
Yeah,
if you don't glorify war, the beauty of like war and destruction, you live in the longhouse or something. Like it's spiritual, like not liking war is spiritually feminine, etc. That's pretty straightforward. Actually, I found where the train thing was, and it kind of ties back to like the deeper influences on Russolo and these other futurists. In the book about Russolo, it says, "Let us return to Leadbetter." That's Charles Leadbetter, the influential American theosophist.
Right.
He was American, right? I know he was based in America. But yeah, Leadbetter was definitely somebody that Russolo read a lot of. And they say that the final paragraph of the chapter on sound is entirely dedicated to what, for him, are noises, that is, principally the sound of machines. Noises, like sounds, can produce sound forms that influence us. Many noises have a negative effect on man because of their negative influx into the aura. But not all noises are malevolent. Some produce sound forms with the power to positively influence our aura. Among the noises that project benevolent sound forms, Leadbetter mentions that of a train in motion. Russolo likewise. So the idea, trains, Theosophy approved on their vibes alone. Russolo likewise lists the noise of the train among the mechanical noises, but this is hardly surprising. Train references were commonplace in Russolo's historical cultural context. More significant is that Leadbetter's laconically detached survey of noises of weapons of war, cannons, rifles, and pistols, and the sound forms they produce, re-echoes distinctly in the chilling and much more developed, but no less detached, paragraph on I rumori della guerra, the noises of war, in the art of noise, where he quotes that poem from what is it, Martinelli?
Marinetti.
Oh, sorry, Marinetti. Yeah, exactly. So that actually goes back to Ledbetter, kind of talking about like the based, like beautiful sounds and vibrations of like war weapons and stuff. So, you know, once again, like kind of a weird Theosophy influence where it's like you could see how it could be turned in like a positive way, even a left-wing way. I mean, after all, some Theosophists, you know, we discovered like in California, some of them had more of like a socialist orientation around the turn of the century. But you start to see definitely like the right wing of Theosophy start to really pick up steam around like the 1910s and the 1920s, even if they kind of break away from like calling themselves Theosophists proper. But, you know, I think that's where you start to see like a little more interest in like eugenics and like the beauty of war, or that there's going to be some kind of apocalyptic thing that elevates the human race and like some scarier ideas.
You know, not like there's few people who seem like, I think it's probably the nature of esotericism up to a point, like doctrinaire like Theosophists like are rare. Like, you know, it's something that people like really like to mix and match and be like eclectic with, you know. Also, I mean,
it's
it
really
helps
a dabbler's religion.
Yeah, it really is. And
but
its
that's not
ideas
to minimize
its
it's not to minimize its influence entirely though, because it seems to have influenced, or like this kind of field of thought like really influenced a lot of people in ways that it maybe was later prudent to like downplay how much they were influenced by it. But you know, even the belief in kind of like, you know, technological, like evolutionary kind of spiritual progress through the development of technology was like a big thing around the turn of the century with Theosophy. And and it's murky to what extent. I think it, from everything we've all dug up, like it seems to have almost like transmuted into things with different names and combined with other things, but like the core interest of the kind of intersection of spirituality and technology was still there. In fact, a big point of this book is that this author wants to clarify a little bit that, you know, even though the futurists were like very obsessed with like machines and almost like the mechanical man and like the man machine kind of these ideas, really like Russolo's obsession with this like noise music was to almost re-sacralize like sound using technology. And in fact, this is almost they argue a kind of like an attempt at like an alchemical ritual to like re-imbue sound that had like been stripped of its like spiritual thing by these like constricting forms that, you know, professional composers were using basically.
Right.
So in a sense there was a spiritual, even though they're diving headfirst in technology, like that spiritual thing is always there. It's never totally gone, even from these very early thinkers.
No, I mean, it would be like,
and I think
again, I think we talked about this
materialism
before, but like, it's worth repeating that like the whole idea of like, oh, you know, spiritualism is like anti-science or something, or anti-technology. That's like not true. And like a very like vulgar kind of like, you know, flawed idea. It just doesn't like hold up. Like, especially in a historical context where like now, you know, discourses of like the science, like, you know, the boundaries of them, like, you know, are policed by like certain people, you know, the people who enforce them, like they might exclude certain things that were under the umbrella of spiritualism. You know, they would distinguish themselves like very strongly from like religion or anything like that. But, you know, there can be critiques made of that, you know, of their like the metaphysical aspects of science, like we've done in other episodes. But like, you know, certainly in a historical context, like there was not a conflict between spiritualism and like interest in technology and in science at all.
Yeah. Actually, like really on that point, they write in the book, he says that like other intellectuals, many of symbolist background, who at the beginning of the 20th century felt that their culture needed radical renewal, Russolo expressed himself extremely polemically, attacking positivism and materialism in all their forms. These two philosophies were, he felt, responsible for every sort of societal evil, making society increasingly bourgeois, quote, museumified and mummified, and he saw in theosophical teaching the antidote to these evils. But he also says Russolo dedicated himself with passion and the rigor of a scientist to the investigations in the physics of light, sound, waves, acoustics, magnetism, spiritualism, and metaphysics. His investigations, which he often referred to in his personal documents and which were frequently mentioned in the accounts of others, were in full agreement with theosophical orthodoxy, according to which the only possible model of science is of a science in contact with the spiritual world. Whether this means that Russolo was attracted by metaphysical rationality or scientific irrationality is merely a semantic exercise. The fact remains that he never wanted to compromise his work with anything he thought was shallow or materialistic. Russolo often engaged in a polemic against materialism, and the spirituality of his approach to research was so crucial to his entire career as to confer upon it a strong poetic unity. In fact, Russolo aspired to an art that would recreate the spiritual side of the world instead of merely imitating it impressionistically. He was after an art that would reflect reality by recreating its spirit, its essence, an art that would dare to dig into the heart of things and reach their deepest spiritual level. So
yes,
yeah,
this is like really great because you can really it's these sort of dichotomies, and this also is true, I think, of the political dichotomies that people make in some cases, that they're much more porous than they appear. But certainly, people will set up a dichotomy between symbolism and futurism, right, based on the archaicizing impulses of symbolism, or maybe something like that, whatever idea would obtain there. But really, there's huge interpenetration between them, and that's true even of naturalism, like Zola or whatever, that also interacts with symbolism and with these other more avant-garde movements, Dadaism, things like that these all were avant-garde, so all were at the time had a novelty and had an energy around them, especially when it comes to intellectual history like this, or certainly the history of art, these sort of dichotomies, they don't hold up super well.
Elaborazione per intonarumori, pianoforte, violino e voce, c'est moi.
Let's talk about the actual praxis of Luigi Russolo and his actual experiments with making a new type of instrument, because that's exactly what he does about right around the time he was writing the Art of Noise manifesto. He starts to invent these new instruments that he calls the intonarumori, or I think that translate to I don't know what intone, I assume it means in tone, but one thing I thought was interesting is that rumori is the, I guess, Italian word for noise, And it made me think about like the etymology. I don't know if maybe you know this, but the etymology of the word rumor, perhaps it comes from Latin, but the idea that like a rumor is like, sometimes people will say like, oh, people were making noises about something, like basically they were gossiping. And so like rumori, just means generally noises, but I guess somehow ended up in English as like a rumor, like, a malicious, like unverified thing somebody is saying. I don't know.
Rumor probably originally had like a similar to murmur. Like murmur, we can perceive that it has like an onomatopoeic thing, but probably like rumor also had an onomatopoeia to it. We've kind of lost that because, but it, you can kind of hear that like there's an onomatopoeia like rumor, like,
I see. Interesting. Yeah. So he makes this like intonarumori, which is, let's see. I mean, they were not electronic yet, but if you look at pictures of them, they look like a bunch of like phonograph kind of horns arranged in like weird things next to a bunch of kind of like speaker boxes. A basic description is the boxes had various types of internal construction to create different types of noise music. Often a wheel was touching a string attached to a drum. The wheel rattled or bowed the strings, while the drum functioned as an acoustic resonator. Many of the instruments featured a handle on top of the box, which was used to vary the string tension. Pulling the handle raised the tone, and the horn attached to the box amplified the sound. Intonarumori, or noise tuner in Italian, made noise, but not at a very high volume, since they were all acoustic. And yeah, he made a number of these. He played them live, I guess, to kind of like varied receptions. And kind of mysteriously, only sketches of all of these devices exist because almost all of them were destroyed in Paris during bombing in World War II, and others just disappeared. So we actually don't. In fact, the author, I think, of that book, Luciano Cessa, directed a reconstruction project on its 100th anniversary to produce accurate replicas of the intonarumori. And then they premiered it at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in 2009. But so this was like an early attempt at kind of making this kind of like drone noise music, albeit with an acoustic instrument. But like this, I think that the reason we're focusing on him so much is because he's really the first one to, I think, lay a lot of like the theoretical, almost philosophical groundwork and really make a case for a new type of music that like captures and amplifies and distorts and mixes up sounds that are not made by natural instruments into something that like you could call music. And
he's certainly like an emblematic person who like represents that tendency like in the development of like this type of electronic music.
I think what this really has a huge influence on, though I think we have someone else to get to before we get to these guys, but is the musique concrète movement in France in the 1940s, which I think was kind of mostly led by like Pierre Schaeffer. And these French composers kind of picked up on the same idea of, musique concrète basically means like concrete music or like real music, right? And they engaged in a lot of experiments, I think starting in the late 40s, with recording natural sounds and then like overlaying them on other sounds and things like that. That, of course, would go off to have like a huge influence on like the subsequent wave. But there's another big development that happens in kind of the early, history of electronic music and electronic instruments that was so much more fascinating than, I don't know why I didn't key into it earlier as like a really interesting story in its own right, but I found a lot of interesting shit about it. And that is about an instrument that came out really that came together around the late 1910s and like 1920 called the theremin.